How would you characterize the state of Jesuit Latin learning in the 17th century?
So, over the course of the 1600s, I mean, if you go back even further into the 1500s, the Jesuits are already starting to open up schools. And so, through the 1600s, they're opening up hundreds and hundreds of schools all over Europe. And this is standardized to a certain extent. It's always hard to tell how much it's actually standardized on the ground. That's even true today. You can read standards for schools, and then you go into the schools. They don't necessarily look like what they're supposed to look like. But perhaps really uniquely for that era, because we have the Ratio Studiorum and its fullest form, it's published in 1599. We have a pretty good picture of what the schools were supposed to look like, and we know that there were, as I said, more and more being opened every year all through the 1600s. So what you have essentially is a system of schooling that it's hard to compare apples to apples, but we can think of it sort of like what we would nowadays think of as middle to high school. That's what they called the lower studies, and then stretching into what we would think of as college, which is their higher studies course essentially. But for just for lower studies, we're talking about kids who were somewhere between the age of like 8 to 10, and they're going to be in just that lower studies course, in which they're essentially, more than anything else, just studying grammar, rhetoric, and literature for about 6 or 7 years. And then many students, that's their whole education at that school. Then again, other students will still continue to go on, especially people who are going to be perhaps pursuing religious life. They'll go on to the higher school. So in the lower school, you have, I mean, again, this is what's so great about not only the Ratio Studiorum itself, but the like volumes and volumes and volumes of histories. The Jesuits, like a lot of early moderns, but perhaps more than some, really liked taking records and writing their own histories of themselves and other things like that. So you have all these like very, very detailed descriptions of what every single, like what every course is supposed to look like, what it looked like even in what a course looked like in Germany versus what it looked like in France. And so it goes from basically the level at which a student would enter. They had to already be able to read, and it would be ideal if maybe they already were somewhat familiar with morphology, but they didn't necessarily have to be. But outside of that ability to sort of do basic reading and writing, students are taken through from the very beginning of Latin grammar, all the way up to being able to, not only read classical Latin literature well, but also being able to write and speak, deliver orations. And again, because there's so much of this, because we have so much evidence, both in terms of documentation about the nature of this school system itself, but then also we have, I mean, even more in a way, just like, libraries, small libraries, but libraries full of things written by people who are educated in this system. And we have a really clear picture, like they got incredibly skilled at using Latin, at reading Latin. I mean, it's not only down to the Jesuits that we have, the sort of high-powered modern philology that we have, but these are among other things, while they're also busy doing a lot of other stuff. The Jesuits are very busy, as you know, but one of the things that they're doing is really advancing classical studies in a pretty significant way, as a result of having this, among other things, having this school system.
You've mentioned this book now a couple times, the Ratio Studiorum. Could you explain what that is?
So the Ratio Studiorum is basically the formalization. It was published in its most, so it's basically a formalization of the basic kind of rules and regulations of how a Jesuit school is supposed to be run. And it gets actually into a whole bunch of detail about, like I said, even, like literally prescribing down to the hour and parts of the hour, how the courses are supposed to work, what the expectations are, what the students have to be able to do to move on to the next. It lays out the entire curriculum. it lays out the responsibilities in a general sense of the teacher. It kind of lays out, it's a little bit actually light on sort of like a justification for it. Like, in other words, there's not necessarily as much about the sort of philosophy of why it is the way it is, but it essentially is a standardization of what's supposed to happen in these schools. It went through a couple different forms from the mid 1500s on, but in its fixed form from 1599 all the way up until the suppression of the order in 1773, this is like the source for, I mean, it's a good source for us, but I mean, for Jesuit schools, this is what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, even like I said, right down to, here are the authors you're supposed to be reading in each year. Here are, even for the grammar section, so the lower studies are split up into originally 3 years of grammar, a course in what they called humanitas, and then a course in rhetoric, which usually kids stayed in for 2 years. And that first grammar year also gets doubled pretty quickly. So the point is, in each one of those different stages, grammar, humanitas, and the rhetoric course, I mean, it says like, here are the specific textbooks you're even supposed to use, which nowadays I guess doesn't sound that impressive or interesting, because that's, like, you can drown easily in all of the standards and documents, even just in an individual state where someone's a teacher. But you turn the clock back to the 15, 16, 1700s. This is actually really, it's impressive. And this was very influential as a sort of, you can think of it as either a reform movement or a way to bring aspirations of Renaissance schooling to fruition. But at any rate, it's not something actually that you expect to see in such great detail from the early modern period. So it's an enormously useful source for us of information about what people were doing in schools, and what some of the most successful schools, were how some of the most successful schools were structured. So it's pretty neat information.
Mhm. You mentioned this term, humanitas. Could you explain a bit more what they meant by that?
Sure. So, I mean, this goes back ultimately to the idea elaborated by Cicero of the studia humanitatis. But I mean, essentially, after they've done their initial course in grammar, and they're already starting to read literature, they introduce literature even in very small amounts very early on in the curriculum, within the first year or two at the very latest. But by the time that they've gotten through those first 3 or 4 years of, let's say, and it really is about 4 or 5 hours a day of just studying Latin, and after the first couple of years, their goal is to, and this is again prescribed in the Ratio Studiorum, they're supposed to be doing all of this in Latin by like around the 3rd year. After they've wrapped all that up, they need to start really working through classical authors, and this is because essentially the Studia Humanitatis are meant to build the capacity to read well, to speak well, to write well, because essentially it's, I think, in the nature of this kind of schooling, that you had to be able to do those things in order to then go on and do any other later studies. That's just part of what they thought of as the development of an educated person. In the book that that I'm have been recording, which is a sort of teacher's manual that gets added to the Ratio Studiorum as a somewhat, I mean, it is an official, doesn't have the same status, but it's an official Jesuit guide to sort of teaching within the Ratio Studiorum. In that book, the second half that's just about, it's because it's called De Ratione Discendi et Docendi, the second half of the book that's about teaching, he says it's great. He says in basically like one sentence, the job of the teacher is to teach pietas and litteras, like that, or pietatem et litteras. That's it. So I think you can think of for the Jesuits, the Studia Humanitatis are, on the one hand, they're not necessarily seen as being distinct from a uniquely Christian education, because obviously they predate Christianity, but they're seen as a sort of like a crucial part of that process, actually, of character formation and of building erudition.
Yeah. And that is, correct me if I'm wrong, where we get the term humanities from in
Yeah, that's
modern
absolutely. I mean,
education.
that's like literally exactly where we get the concept of a humanities education, for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Two more words, if you could define, please.
Sure.
You said pietas and pietatem and literas. Could you
Literas. Yeah.
explain?
Yeah, sure. So pietas, I think the Jesuits were extremely sensitive. I mean, not every single Jesuit. I don't know about all of them, but the best Jesuit scholars are very sensitive readers. So I don't necessarily know in this context if the implication is exactly the classical concept of pietas, which is really that sense of sort of duty, right, and obedience to duty to, like Cicero says in the De Republica, it's about your patria, your homeland, and your family or whatever. But obviously in Christian literature, that idea, and this is where we get the English word of concept of piety, it takes on this idea of an obligation and responsibility to God. So you can think of it as roughly analogous to, not exactly, but roughly analogous to sort of to piety, to basically developing the sort of Christian virtues in the sense of service to God. I think that's how like the Jesuits thought of that pietas piece. He goes on in that that this is actually the first portion of that teaching half of the manual. It's really like how to properly orient students so that everything that they're doing is stemming from this sense of Christian devotion. I guess that would be another way to think of the pietas, is that Christian devotion. The literae, on the other hand, I mean, that's literature. And for Jesuits, and I think for early modern pedagogues more generally, it was taken for granted that even though certainly, and this is an important thing to keep in mind, Latin had a very real and practical role for someone who is going through this education. I mean, there were reasons why you needed to be able to use Latin well that are not necessarily the same. That those reasons don't necessarily exist for us nowadays. But in addition to the kind of practical benefits of knowing Latin, the idea was you needed to be able to read and learn from literature. This is, again, this is a core portion of their educational process.
So I do want to get to the Ratione Discendi et
Discendi et Docenti, yeah.
Yeah,
It's like one of those early
which is
modern titles are like
right, and that of course in English means on the sort of like the thought behind teaching and learning might be a good way to translate it.
Yeah.
But that happens at the end of the 16th, at the end of the 17th century, right? He publishes it in 1703,
Yeah.
if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
In the century leading up to that, obviously we have the Ratio Studiorum published in 1599. So we got 100 years in between those two books.
Yeah.
Could you give a sort of brief, perhaps specific example of the kind of thing that students would be reading in that time period?
Sure. I mean, it's on the one hand, it would look, I think there are things about it that might look different from what you would see in a classics department nowadays, for sure. But I also think on the other hand, it wouldn't be out of, so a lot of what they're reading would not be out of place in a what we think of as a kind of standard classical, certainly at the secondary school level, or I'm sorry, at the higher education level, a sort of classical education, meaning they're going to be reading Cicero. Cicero is actually, Cicero is, easily, and he's name checked in the Ratio Studiorum. Everything should flow from Cicero as far as style is concerned. And that's taken for granted, as it would have been for most early moderns. But you're reading Cicero, you would let's say start with what they consider to be the easier philosophical dialogues of Cicero. After you might read some Phaedrus, and some of the shortest letters of Cicero. And we have great editions. I mean, there's multiple editions you can find of just exactly what the order of the letters are of Cicero that they would use. I mean, starting from the really, there's like plenty of letters of Cicero that are 2 lines, 3 lines. So they start there in the first couple years. They also have some of their own colloquia that they use that are designed to help facilitate the process for students of being able to eventually only use Latin to communicate. But then within the first couple years, they're going to start reading, let's say 1 year, they're just going to work their way through the easier philosophical dialogues of Cicero. So that would be the De Senectute or the De Amicitia. And then they're also going to start, doing, they're going to start doing some poetry with, usually they'll maybe do some of the eclogues. They liked to use expurgated versions of Ovid, but they tried, obviously they're staying away from, there's some stuff that they're like, we're clearly not going to be teaching like Ars Amatoria or anything like that, but they liked the Tristia or some of the more chaste works of Ovid. But I mean, I think, and then they're moving on to reading more Cicero, and eventually they're really, because the Jesuits are huge on rhetoric, so they're going to be studying, in particular, orations of Cicero. And again, I mean, they're moving from a kind of a grammar curriculum, and then Humanitas is like sort of literary studies, and then the course in rhetoric is basically being able to then analyze works at a large. So you're starting off analyzing things, I mean, at the sentence and word chunk level with a lot of parsing. I mean, it's actually, they were using Latin as their language of instruction as early as possible, but we also shouldn't deceive ourselves into thinking that they weren't spending tons of time on building a very rigorous, robust, and explicit understanding of grammar. But the point is, after they've done that word and sentence level analysis, then they're starting to move into paragraph length chunks. And then by the time they get to the course in rhetoric, they're able to look at a speech of Cicero and say, okay, like, here are all the different parts. Here's the exordium, and they're outlining speeches, trying to rewrite it using their own language, but following the outline that Cicero uses, that sort of thing. But yeah, so sorry to get back to your question. The curriculum is like what we would tend to think of I don't know, I can't speak for everybody, but it's what I imagined it was going to be like when I went to school for classics. And it isn't necessarily exactly what I found the experience to be, but it's like, I'm going to read the great Latin authors. I'm going to read Cicero. I'm going to read maybe some, they followed the ancient grammarians, and, they read their Sallust. They absolutely read Terence, but again, they would sometimes expurgate portions of his plays. I think the teachers probably read a lot of Plautus. They tended not to give Plautus to students as often because it gets a little bit racier. They loved Horace. I mean, they loved great Latin poetry, so they loved Virgil. Virgil for them was this, sort of the two core authors are going to always be Cicero and Virgil for them, but they also loved Horace. But again, there's some parts you got to cut out.
So expurgate. Could you just
yeah,
define
sure.
that?
So they would do two different things with an author. And again, this gets back to this idea of pietas, which they took very seriously. They believed that there was enormous value for students, even in a highly religious educational setting, to reading great classical and pagan authors, but they also were sensitive to the reality that you're going to find stuff in Horace that is not appropriate for a 12-year-old Catholic schoolboy in 1650. So basically what they would do is either cut out portions of the text, purge them, expurgare, or like kind of clean them out, or they would, and this might cause people to raise an eyebrow now because it seems like it's, like doing damage to the author, but they would find a way to keep the meter the same in a poem of Horace and just change the word like amores to like kamenas, like the muses or something like that. So they would gently tweak these texts in order to make them school appropriate. But we also have to keep in mind, I mean, they're always working from classical exemplars in every respect, but both students and also the teachers themselves are constantly cranking out imitations. And after a certain point, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of plays, epic poems. I mean, poems in every genre. They really did love plays, though. There's a whole kind of like secondary scholarship just on, and you can find all kinds of interesting information about Jesuit school plays. They're really important and influential in that period. So eventually they also have their own plays they're able to put on, more or less strictly about religious themes or historical themes, and that way they don't have to like deal with some of the racier parts of like Plautus or something like that.
Right. So then we get to 1703, and then we have this figure. His name in Latin is Juvencius. I don't really know how to pronounce it in French.
Yeah, I don't
Who
really
is this
either.
guy?
I mean, it's Joseph de Jouvancy. That's my guess, but my French is terrible, so apologies to anyone who's French out there. Yeah, so he's a member of the order, and he's as a lot of these Jesuit scholars and academics were. He has this like wide-ranging ability. He was at one point working on writing the history of the order. You can find, we were just talking about the expurgated editions. He published like 20 different editions, school editions of every classical author you can think of. And it's really, it's inspiring, it's awe-inspiring, it's also almost depressing to look. He's able to go through, not only just like read through and obviously really deeply understand and appreciate all of this stuff, all these different authors. He's also writing all these notes in Latin, which these are really, really neat. They're not the same thing for the most part. These notes are not usually used for the like Adusum Delphini texts, the Dauphin text that you might be familiar with, where there's famous editions of texts with Latin notes on the Latin text. But they're doing something very similar. So de Jouvancy does something similar with tons of authors, and then he also understands the text well enough that he's even, like I said, able to figure out how to he's going to rewrite portions of Horace to make it appropriate for school. So he has this, he has this sort of acumen as a school teacher and obviously a highly skilled Latinist. And I will say too, I tend to focus on Latin because that is my Latin's certainly stronger, sadly, at this point than my Greek. Greek was also important to them, and I can say more about that, but I want to make sure that I mention that. But at any rate, and Greek was started very early as well in the Jesuit schools, or at least was supposed to be. But coming back to de Jouvancy, he ends up being basically, he writes a little pamphlet for sort of, I think, trying to offer some guidance to make sure that the reality on the ground in schools is conforming to the ideals laid out in the Ratio Studiorum. You get the sense, and this is hard because we're talking about an enormous geographical region. It's not even just, the Jesuits are all over the place. So we're talking about anywhere where there were Jesuits and Jesuit schools. And so there's a sense that there is, not everyone's following the Ratio exactly the same way. And so he writes this kind of small pamphlet intended to sort of say, here's really exactly how you should be as a teacher doing your own learning. And then how you should be passing that on to your students. And he ends up being asked by the order, as I understand it, to make this a more formal book. So like late 1600s, he comes up with a pamphlet. By 1703, it's being published as this sort of official, I don't know exactly, it's not like an imprimatur, but in other words, it is treated by the order as this is an official guide that you can sort of distribute along with the Ratio, or whatever. We can use this as our standard for what teachers are supposed to, how teachers are supposed to attack this responsibility. And it was a responsibility that, my understanding is that most Jesuits had to go through a period of teaching in the schools. They all had to be, so this is the thing. This is where we get these amazing texts from, like you can read a text about what it was like to live in Japan in the 1500s or whatever in Latin, because Jesuits you had to be really skilled at Latin, to be able to operate at a high level as a Jesuit. And so you're moving through this school system, and then you're maybe even participating at least for a few years in the process of teaching at the lower school. But yeah, so this book at any rate is intended to help offer guidance for teachers, because obviously, they're continuing to grow, in not just as an order, but their schools are continuing to grow. These are highly respected, is a very successful school program, and so you get the sense that they want to make sure that everyone is on board and understands what they're supposed to be doing.
And then that book again is De Ratione Discendi et
Discendi et
Docendi.
Docendi, yeah, and it's split into two parts. So, so the first part is essentially about teacher formation, and it's like, what do you need to know and be able to do, sort of in your own personal erudition. He uses the term eruditio, like what do you have to be able to do as a teacher? And then the second half is, it doesn't cover all the same territory as the Ratio Studiorum, because there's obviously already stuff there about what you're supposed to be doing in each class level. But he offers a whole host of different ways of approaching this idea of teaching pietatem and also teaching litteras. The part that I haven't yet published, that I've, from the second half of the book in the readings that I've been doing, is, he gets into incredible detail. It's basically lesson plans. He walks you through exactly how you can do what the Jesuits called a praelectio. So one of the core features of their one of the core features of their teaching, is every day is a process called a praelectio, which it doesn't look in some ways totally dissimilar from what still happens sort of in classics departments nowadays, I think, where you're doing a close reading of an author, and just sort of working through a text. But it's great. He literally gives you, here's what it would look like in the, it's like a script you can read. And the sense you have is that a new teacher is meant to be able to follow this almost as a script and then apply it to other texts. Here's exactly how you would read through a text in the lowest possible level. Here's how you would do it of grammar. Here's how you do it in the middle grammar course. Here's how you do it in the humanitas course. And here's what it would look like in the rhetoric course. So it's really, really fascinating to see not only the big picture, like sort of, how should you approach your students and how can you help to motivate them and that sort of thing, but also like literally, this is exactly what you should be doing at this point in this lesson. Like this is, in 1703.
Yeah. And as you've alluded to a couple times, you've been making sort of audiobook styles, not necessarily audiobook style, because you are explaining things as you go along.
Yeah.
You are annotating, and if I'm using that word correctly, and helping people who are at a lower level in Latin comprehension
Sure.
to follow along. And those videos can all be found on your YouTube channel. I'll have the link to that in the description in the pinned comments. So, if people can understand Latin, they should go and check that out immediately. If they can't, how does the book begin?
So the book lays out, I think, sort of like, sort of more or less what I just said. And this is, I will say, another feature that I love about these Jesuit texts is that even though they are, the Jesuits are classical humanists par excellence, like that, there's no question about that. But they also still, I think sometimes we have this somewhat simplistic idea that in the Renaissance, there was like such a reaction against the sort of Aristotelian scholasticism of the Middle Ages that like everyone just stopped being able to like use syllogisms or whatever. But really, you have to remember that in the upper school, which the upper studies that like, people who are going to become members of the order are going to go through, they're also still doing all of their theology classes, and classes in philosophy, moral philosophy, mathematics, etc. So they also have a very rigorous and systematic way of thinking and kind of organizing their thoughts, in a way that you can think of as being sort of this Aristotelian scholastic tradition. So in other words, in the sort of like the first part of the book, he lays out, he basically says like, here's the outline of this book that you're going to read. If you're going to be a teacher, first of all, there's 3 different things that you have to know. You have to have good knowledge of the languages. You have to have knowledge of a certain set of, he calls them scientia, but it's basically like artes. These are domains of knowledge and skill that you have to have. And then you also have to have some sort of study habits that can help to sort of get as much as you can out of the limited time that you have as a teacher. So that's the sort of de ratione discendi part. And then he says, and then I'm going to explain to you the different things that you can do in order to, like I said, in order to teach well, breaking it down into this idea of pietas and literae. And in each one, I mean, it's really, I think there's something kind of fun and charming about it, because it's like, and I've stumbled over this actually in doing the recordings. It's like the books, there's like part 1 and part 2. And then in each part there's chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. And then in each chapter there's articulus 1, articulus 2, like, and then even more than that, there's like little subheadings in each one. Incredibly well organized and lucid. And it also follows, the fun part is, at a certain point when he's talking about how to appropriately write your own work, he's talking about an oration, I think, but he basically advocates doing exactly that. You write an outline and then you fill in all the details. You can tell that's what he did with this book.
Yeah. I don't want to pause this just after getting started, but you mentioned this term syllogism. And could you explain what you mean by that? How is what we're reading different than what you might have read like 300 years prior?
So, so the idea, right, the syllogism is just, it's this idea of a certain kind of formal logic that you find, right, I think most, as I understand it, most influentially expressed in the works of Aristotle, originally, right, as I know, mostly transmitted in the earlier Middle Ages through Latin translations, and then eventually there's this process of we can say recovering the original texts. But I think the important point here is that on the one hand, what seems to be different, and this is actually an area where I think there's a lot of like controversy, and I'm not sure exactly how I think about it. I think what we can say is this: it is pretty clear that there is a difference in, at the very least, emphasis in schooling from this, Renaissance or like early modern period compared with the Middle Ages. So, the emphasis in particular on the role of literature, and in particular on the role of classical literature is clearly more significant in this early modern period. It is possible. I think it's hard because it's like, there's obviously a misconception that like people in the Middle Ages, and again, I know that we're on the same page about this, there's this misconception that people in the Middle Ages like didn't know any classical authors, or like that there was just, like widespread ignorance of classical authors. And that's obviously not true. I think what's fair to say is that there was a marked emphasis from the Renaissance into the early modern period on imitating classical authors in a way that was not necessarily the priority in the Middle Ages. And then, so to bring it back to this question of like, scholasticism, scholastic education seems to have been, as I understand it, much more significantly focused on, again, after a certain amount of initial skill building, basically like working your way through and kind of maybe commenting on certain set problems in theology and in logic. And I think the point I would simply make, I guess, is that it seems to me that, again, it comes back to this question of trying to compare apples to apples. My sense is that the Jesuits probably are educating a much larger portion of younger students in earlier studies than you would necessarily see in what you might consider to be a comparable school in the Middle Ages. And so as a result, maybe you look at the Middle Ages and you think, well, they were like way more focused on Aristotle. My sense is that in the upper schools of the Jesuits, there's still plenty of focus on not only on Aristotle, but there's still plenty of focus on philosophy, logic, and other what we would consider to be those sort of higher pursuits. They just also it's the nature of the school system that it's a sort of pyramid, in the bottom, which is the biggest part, is mostly this very intense and again rigorous grounding in grammar and literature. Did that kind
Right.
of answer the question?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. But with that now covered, I do want to ask the kind of main question of the night, which
Sure.
is, if you were a student of, and please correct the framing of the question if you think
Yeah.
it's inaccurate, but if you were a student that was being taught under the instruction of a magister using Juvencius's work,
Yeah.
this treatise on Discendi et Docendi, what would your Latin education be like?
To start at the beginning, you would begin, and I think this is something again that we sometimes have a tendency to look at, and again, I want to obviously kind of like just basic grounding here. There's obviously we have to use a lot of generalization. We talk about this. Obviously, there are loads of different types of early modern schools. The Jesuit schools are just one type. There's also loads of variety within them. Blah 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 blah. But I think to the extent that we can generalize, we can say students would actually have been early on still using the vernacular and in the earliest level and hearing the vernacular themselves, but there was by the second or third year, so vernacular, just that's their native language. So, but by the second or third year, one of the features that I think is distinctive that needs to be mentioned early on is the goal of the whole, and this is very, very clearly laid out in the Ratio Studiorum, the goal of the entire, perhaps not the goal, but one of the standards is everything needs to be done in Latin as much as possible. There are questions about exactly to what extent that's followed, but it is, I think, abundantly clear from the evidence that that was at least followed a lot in a lot of places at a lot of times during this whole period of education. So that's an important thing for us to think of. Students are encouraged and to some extent sort of forced in school at any rate to use Latin as a language of communication, and really, really crucially, instruction after the first couple years, especially after the first year, instruction is intended to be in Latin. I want to point out, because I think it's important, they have a lot of time, and this is really, really, it can color our perception when we compare, again, what we do now or what we're able to do in school or out of school with what they were doing then. They have it really is 2.5 hours in the morning, 2.5 hours in the afternoon of actual school time. And then there's a certain amount of additional home time. But so we're already talking about 5 hours a day. More or less, in Latin by the second or third year. And the schooling continues into Saturday. It's not necessarily a full day, but they're going 5 or 6 days a week. They have plenty of holidays and sort of vacation breaks, but it's not like a full summer vacation like a lot of schools have now. So they're in school a lot, and they're getting a lot of instruction in Latin. In addition to the fact that everything's in Latin, though, the early grammar education is actually, in many ways, I think, and this might be disappointing to people to hear, it's really not terribly dissimilar from what we think of as being the sort of traditional Latin education. And when I say traditional, I have to use scare quotes, because I think there's a little bit of like, there's an extent to which people tend to sort of like establish a sort of narrative where like, first there was like good Latin education, and that was like what we want to do. And then like in the 1800s, everyone lost their minds and just came up with like bad Latin education, where they were like, you should just not know how to do anything in Latin. And then somewhere in like the 20th century, starting with Rouse, and then eventually like, with other people like recovered what good Latin education looks like. I have to say, what I find from, all this reading that I'm doing in this form of early modern schooling and others, is that that's really not necessarily a super accurate picture. The reality is, even in these Jesuit schools in which being able to use the language well was absolutely an important feature of the schooling, both in terms of method and also goals, they are also basically memorizing like an entire functional grammar of of Latin. So I'm not saying that they're memorizing like Alan and Greenough, but they're certainly memorizing as much grammar as you memorize if you work your way through Wheelocks. When I say memorizing, like, if you look at the Alvarez book or the Tercellini edition of Alvarez, so these are two of the different grammars that are mentioned in the Ratio Studiorum, you can find them, and I have a copy right here that I had printed out. But if you look at them, I mean, they still are filled with these didactic poems that you would memorize. Kids, I mean, to better and more succinctly answer your question about what it's like to learn Latin, for the first 3 years or 4, you're memorizing. Like, you're memorizing a ton. You're not just memorizing, and you're not just memorizing charts. You're memorizing chunks of language that are meaningful, and you're getting tons and tons of continual exposure to classical exemplars that illustrate the whatever grammar rule you're learning about. But you're also learning formally about how all languages work in their conception, and also specifically how Latin works as a language. So you're memorizing grammar rules. You're hearing a ton of Latin because they're teaching by the second year the Latin grammar in Latin. So you're also just getting a lot of, incidentally, like hours of what we would call comprehensible input. You are also the day's broken into these little kind of 15-minute, hour chunks. You're also kind of competing with students to kind of repeat things from memory, to rewrite things that you've been given. Like there's a constant process of taking in and then putting out. And it's all really, really practical in a way that I think, is also maybe not unique, but is, it's one of the distinguishing characteristics of the education. So kids are, as soon as possible, they're asked to start trying to compose their own works. They're, like I said, they're kind of like competing to see who can come up with the best translation. I will say they use translation a fair amount in the first 3 or 4 years as well, which again, I don't want to burst people's bubbles, but I think that they thought of these things as all being part of the process of building an ironclad capacity to use the language in a grammatically correct way. And then also, as I said, starting very early on, you're starting to work through, at first very small, and then eventually bigger and bigger chunks of authors. And when I say work through, I mean you're reading it. The teacher's explaining everything to you in Latin. They're walking you through it. And then you're taking that home and writing a theme on it on your own in Latin, or you're memorizing it, and then you're competing with a friend to see who can deliver the memorized passage better. As we move up the ladder of the courses, the tasks become more and more complex. So at first it's literally like, can you regurgitate this basically, or can you explain this? Why is this case? Why is this, why is this ending? But at the higher levels, I mean, it becomes like who can write who can do a better job converting prose into poetry and poetry into prose, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I think a question that I'm going to ask later in the interview is going to be like, how can people nowadays use this material to learn and improve their Latin? But with that example specifically, let's say someone is watching this right now and is so taken by that idea that they want to try it on their own. Could you give like a concrete example of like a passage, a text that like a student might have taken and done something with?
Yeah. I mean, I will say the kinds of exercises early on that they would use are actually strikingly similar to what we think of as sometimes maybe not even the most effective or efficient, but I think there's some twists that are really important. So, and it's funny, I actually just mentioned this in a video that I put out recently. There's a process by which you take a text and you translate it into your vernacular language, and then you sort of put the text aside, and then you go back to your vernacular translation that you made. So I take a little letter of Cicero and I translate it into English, and I make sure that it's good. I mean, this gets corrected by the teacher, or they had this whole process by which like the higher level students helped to review the work of the lower level students. And so it gets reviewed. I make sure my translation is really good. And then I take my translation and that's in English now, and I try to translate it back into Latin. And then when I do that, I'm able to compare the Latin that I came up with the original Latin. And by doing so, I'm able to really perceive clearly the sort of like proprieties of, or the properties rather, of the proprietates, the properties of the Ciceronian prose. I can also see if I made any like stupid grammar mistakes or whatever, but then beyond that point, I can actually already, and I think this is the key to thinking about their method, in addition to all the sort of individual exercises. Even from a very early stage, what they're doing is making sure you have the exemplar in front of you and that you're constantly working from it. What's the distance between me and Cicero? And I'm not saying that any of them necessarily close the gap, because I don't think that it's, for a variety of reasons, I don't think it's necessarily possible. But it is striking the extent to which you can be reading a text written by a Jesuit about like anything, and you're going to see the Ciceronian idiom for whatever they're talking about. I mean, it's like they did this process. So that's just one example of this constantly having a classical exemplar in front of you. And again, even doing things that we think of actually now as being the sort of traditional model of like translation. But I think the key here is they would never suggest that you should just translate and then read your own translation, and that somehow then you're reading Cicero. The goal, though, is to develop a really sensitive awareness of the differences between the languages first in doing the translation from Latin to the vernacular, and then by going the other direction, you're able to compare your kind of innate ear for Latin prose, what you think it should sound like in Latin, with what it ends up actually being in the Ciceronian prose, which again, they took for granted that like Cicero was the peak, which I'm not disagreeing at all, but they don't apologize for that at all.
I think, we, neither of us think that all Latin education should be based on translation. And we have both spoken on various videos about why that can be a bad thing. But if we are singing the praises of translation, I think one thing that's underrated is the fact that it also will force you to improve your own vernacular language. And I have often found that my English composition has gotten much better when I'm doing translation practices. But Jouvancy actually talks about vernacular usage as well, doesn't he?
He does. Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think that is actually, that's something that the Jesuits are also aware of. This is something, again, that people might not be necessarily familiar with, but going all the way back to medieval schooling and certainly through the early modern period, when you're learning to read, you're not, generally speaking, learning to read in your vernacular tongue. Like you're starting off with your like Psalterium, you have your little like Latin prayers that you're memorizing, and you're learning to like decode language using sort of phonics or whatever the process is. But you're doing that still with Latin. Like, it's hard for us to understand now the extent to which the vernacular was thought of as being like, yeah, you're going to learn it anyway. It's not important. But to your point, I think that the early modern pedagogues in general, and certainly that includes the Jesuits, they appreciated the extent to which by doing this this kind of translation exercise, you also do improve your vernacular, which in 1599, when the Ratio comes out, is maybe, somewhat important. But as time goes on into the 17 and 1800s, this becomes more and more important. And so I think that is something that they're aware of and that also appreciate about that. I mean, I think one other point I would make, because I just want to clarify. Yeah, I don't want to suggest that translation is by any means the only exercise. And in fact, I would say it seems to be more limited, I would say, to the earlier years for them. But just, I think it's important to keep in mind that they certainly did not see it, because I think some people have a sort of superstition about translation nowadays. They were so practical, and this is again something I admire about them. They, in the very first year, and you see this again in Jouvancy's book, in the very first year, when you're walking a student through like a 2-line little snippet of like an Aesop poem or whatever, they took for granted, like, yeah, you're going to speak in the vernacular and you're going to translate it into the vernacular. But the idea was you don't stop there. Once you've translated it so that they understand exactly what the Latin says, then you go back and you're talking about the Latin. And all of what you're doing is basically kind of modeling for the student what the process will then be in the next year when you're going to be doing the same thing, but you're only doing it in Latin. Then you're going to be reading not the exact same poem, but maybe again, you're only be reading a letter of Cicero that's 3 lines long. Then you're reading it in Latin, and the teacher's explaining it in simple Latin. And by doing that, right, they're just the goal here is actually, again, they're not using this terminology at all, but they understood intuitively, I guess, or just through lots and lots of practice, that comprehension is crucial. That there's no point in memorizing stuff or, doing these kinds of exercises if you don't understand what you're doing. So.
In terms of texts that they would memorize, obviously the Aeneid probably
Tons and tons of,
yeah, probably the biggest one. What other kind of things would they just commit to memory from classical Latin?
I mean, that's a great question. I would say classical Latin wise, it's very clear that they're committing. I think poetry, right away, it's always easier to do. I certainly see lots and lots. I mean, they had this whole process. They were, another feature of this schooling system is that the same way that we now zealously and vigorously engage in athletic competitions, they loved having, academic competitions and what they call declamationes, but I think we can think of as sort of recitals, basically. And so they would memorize, all kinds of lyric poetry. I mentioned the Jesuit theater. I mean, they absolutely, teachers wrote those plays sometimes and kids would put them on, but they also had students writing scenes of plays or plays. And the way that they would get good at being able to do that was first by memorizing huge chunks of Seneca for tragedies, huge chunks of, like I said, mostly Terence, because they tended not to read Plautus as much with kids, although they didn't mind if you cut out all the unsavory parts. I think the biggest thing though would be memorizing. It was entirely standard to expect students to memorize speeches of Cicero. They were particularly interested in oratory, for kind of, like literally for practical reasons. Like it was important to the order for people to be able to speak persuasively, and so they would certainly. I don't think a student would get through a course from beginning to end in the 6 years in the lower studies or 7 years in the lower studies without having memorized probably multiple speeches of Cicero's, which I know from I know you have parts of the First Calenarian. You take possession of the language and you come to understand it in a way that you just can't if you're just kind of like glancing at it. So you can see why it was a really I don't want to necessarily say efficient because it probably took a lot of time, but it was at any rate probably very effective.
Mhm. I think the last major question then is for people, as I've alluded to earlier, for people now today who want to use this text, who want to use the Jesuits' mores to really improve their own Latin or to even get started learning it, what should they do?
I think that's a great question. Yeah, and I apologize if I haven't given as much detail perhaps as would be helpful. I think the things that are most important that I find most helpful in this text are not necessarily specific specific exercises or even the specific Jesuit texts. Although I do think if people are interested in like reading early modern books, there's it's a ton of fun, cool stuff to read. But I think the important takeaways for someone at any level with Latin are, first of all, and I think this is a tough point to say because I don't necessarily know when exactly this should happen, but we should keep in mind and be mindful of the fact that for students to advance from one level to the next, they had to have mastered the content and the skills in the prior level. So for them, in the first 3 or 4 years, you need to master the morphology and syntax of the language. You need to be able to ask and answer questions about what is happening at the word and sentence level with respect to form. But I think on the other hand, you got to remember it's always about form in use. So it's not just like about memorizing a table, but it is about being able to explain to yourself, like, what does it mean that this is like laudabit and not laudat, for example, right? So that's one thing I will say, is that I think it's fair to my perspective, and this, I have found this to be true personally anyway, but I think from if you look at their system of schooling, if you don't have that bedrock foundation, it is really hard to then move on to classical authors and to try to do anything more. So that would be one thing. I think you have this mastery of elementary, what we might call elementary grammar, but we also have to keep in mind then, and this brings me to the second important point, it takes a really long time to do this. This is something that I think, like, it's actually, if you read a lot about the history of education, classical education, if you want to call it that, like over through the ages, you find this actually, especially, I mean, in any period, certainly after, like after the classical period, but even in the late classical period, there's just a lot of complaints about how long this takes, because the truth is, I think it takes a really long time. I mean, if it took kids 3 or 4 years to really master the fundamental, like, elementary grammar and syntax in a school where they're literally only studying Latin for 5 hours a day for 5 days or 6 days a week, like, I'm not saying that their methods were necessarily the most efficient, but I also think it's like, in a way, it's actually a relief to say, like, oh, okay, like, if they weren't able to really start digging in with authors in a sustained way until their 5th or 6th year in a system like that, then it's okay to think that it's actually it's going to take a little time for anyone. And I will say, though, too, then that brings me to maybe to the third point that I would stress is, none of this is to say that people should defer the reading of classical authors. In fact, again, if we look at the way that the Jesuits did it, you're trying to introduce the authors as soon as possible. You're just being sensitive to the reality that you won't necessarily be able to move through the same amount or at the same pace in the first or second year as you do in the 7th or, whatever, 6th year. So I think those are like the sort of, I guess, 3 easy takeaways I would say is, oh, well, actually, no, here's the 4th one. You absolutely have to view it as a communicative language. I mean, that's the part that's like, I don't stress this because to me, it feels like it's like super obvious. They took for granted too, that your both goal and also the method you had to use was to be able to not only just like interpret the language, but you have to be able to read it authentically, write in it, speak it, like hear someone speak in it and understand it. So I mean, that's like, maybe I have a tendency to soft pedal that, but that's crucial. They wrote that into the rules of the Ratio Studiorum for a reason. And you can tell that not everyone always loved it, because they wouldn't have, come up with systems to try to kind of like chastise people and explain to them why it was so important if there hadn't been a little bit of resistance. But, it's obviously important to try and use the language and create, especially I think in an educational environment, these kinds of sheltered immersion experiences where you're learning the language in the language. So I think those are all things that I would say are useful takeaways for us. And then in addition, like, a whole bunch of other, I think if someone's like a teacher, I'm not saying you necessarily be able to pick up and sort of like bring any one thing from this into your classroom, because some of it might feel outdated, or, schools are very different back then. But I guess this would be the final sort of point that I would make is, I think the part that I'm always struck by with this is, they're working with very different circumstances, a different amount of time, et cetera, et cetera. But we also just can't argue with the results. Like it gives us a vision of what theoretically is possible. And I think sometimes we forget that. And I know sometimes we forget that because I've met plenty of people in my life. And I've also heard opinions from, some pretty like high profile people in the world of classics where they really seem to doubt that it's even possible to be able to like read and write Latin well. And I'm not going to use the term fluency because that's a tricky term and sometimes it doesn't really mean much. But I think if we look at the system of schooling that we see documented in a book like the De Ratione Discendi Docendi, et Docendi, if we look at the Ratio Studiorum, and then if we look at the thousands of books created by people who were educated in this system, all written in Latin, I mean, we can see like this was a thing people were able to do. Like, I'm not saying that every person today should feel this burden that they are going to try to be able to accomplish the same thing in their lifetime because the circumstances are so different. But I find it inspirational to say like this can be done because we see so many people who did it. We have all this incredible evidence, and you can when you get to a certain point, you can pick up and read a book by some like French school teacher, more or less Jesuit school teacher from the 1700s, and you can get his thoughts on what works and what doesn't work in the classroom. That's only possible because they're working in a tradition of treating Latin and the study of Latin and Latin literature as real authentic and worthwhile pursuits.
Mhm. You have a video recently on your channel where you discuss a book called Peak, and
Oh yeah,
you've alluded to a lot of the things in this conversation that you talk about in that video. And the video is in English as well, for
yeah, that's
anyone who
right.
wants to go and check it out. Could you give a brief summation though of what people can expect to like hear about, learn about in that video, what you've learned from that book?
Yeah, sure. So, and I think it does dovetail nicely. I think that book helped. I was really excited to read the book Peak because it actually, there were some new things I learned from it for sure, but it also kind of just fit really neatly with a lot of things I'd already seen and observed in my own learning and also in this, any study I've done of what the history of classical education looks like, specific with a specific focus on the Jesuits. So the book Peak is about the sort of science of expertise and how people who get very good at a skill domain, how they do that and sort of like what the different factors are that go into it. The core feature, according to this, so this is in the without recapping the whole video, the author is actually the guy behind this idea that you might have heard of like takes 10,000 hours to get, to become an expert at a skill or whatever. He's like, I love, he doesn't get petty in the book, but he definitely complains that like Malcolm Gladwell, who popularized that idea, like didn't totally understand it. But his point basically is, across a whole bunch of different skill domains, and this is his life's work to study this, and he lays it out in pretty convincing detail. Basically, the factors that go into someone becoming very, very skilled at any skill, and really the things that distinguish people who are less skilled or people who plateau from people who don't, is the amount of time, but it's not just any time, it's the amount of time, spent on what he terms deliberate practice. And I think deliberate practice for our purposes right now, is exactly the kinds of things that the Jesuits were constantly engaging in. It's authentic attempts to perform meaningful linguistic skills, meaningful linguistic tasks using, using the language, whatever, and that are just slightly outside of your actual, like comfort zone, basically. So, I mean, he demonstrates how this is the case with things, like chess and violin, sports. He does also at times even talk a little bit about language learning, although it's not like the core focus of the book. But I think the idea that resonated or that fit really well with this conversation about the Jesuit schools is that it number one, it takes a long time to get really good at anything. I think number two, the point that I would like to make sort of about, what you look at, when you look at the Jesuit schools, it becomes clear. Even though kids could and often did sort of turn off at different points, not everyone went to the top. They thought by trying to figure out where they wanted people to get to if they were able to do the whole thing. And that's actually even the way the Ratio Studiorum is structured. We might expect nowadays that you'd start with the elementary level, but the document starts off at the peak. And and so that ties into this, I guess, because the title of the book that I made the video about is peak. The idea is it's like figure out where you want to go first. Like, what does it look like to get incredibly good at it? And then what are all of the things that you need to do to get up to that point? And these are also things that he, Erickson, the author of the book on the science of expertise that I'm talking about, those are all things that he lays out. You need to build a mental representation that allows you to continue to perform the skill with greater and greater sensitivity, accuracy, efficiency. It's like one of those things that it makes perfect sense when you hear it. It almost sounds kind of like so obvious and simple. You're like, oh, well, yeah, of course. But I do think somehow we have a tendency to, for one thing, these days we have a tendency, first of all, to sort of like want to find the shortcut, right? And that's like, maybe that's cultural. Maybe I think it's fair. None of us really have. I certainly don't have that much time to put towards these sorts of studies as I'd like. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know where I was going with that, but I think that's the idea is you need to put a lot of time into these things, and that's okay. That's normal, I guess, is where I was maybe trying to get with that. And you also need to accept the reality that if you just only do whatever you've always done, you're not likely to continue to progress. I think the Jesuit system seems to make that very clear. I don't think it necessarily was fun to be in the Jesuit schools. Well, I shouldn't say that, because they tried everything they could to make it fun through things like competition. They actually basically played games, not necessarily kind of games that we would, but they liked to try to play games and make it as lively as possible. The teacher didn't just drone on. It was very important that there was a kind of dialogue, a back and forth with the students. But the point is, it was seen as work. The same way that if you want to get really good, if you want to become a like world-class concert cellist, it's kind of silly to think that you're just going to be able to like do it for, like an hour a week and get there. It doesn't mean you won't get anywhere in an hour a week, but yeah, to wrap this whole thought up, I don't think everyone who studies Latin by any means has to aspire to be to achieve the level of expertise that someone who went through this system of Jesuit schooling was able to at the end of it. I certainly know that I'll probably never get there in my life, but I do think it's actually helpful to have a picture of what the theoretical end goal is, just so that you know where you're trying to head, even if you know you're also probably never going to get there. I think that's, when I used to play saxophone, it was helpful for me to know what Charlie Parker was capable of. Not that I ever thought I was going to get there, but I at least was able to see like, okay, like there are, on the one hand, there are more things that it would take to get there than I will ever want to or be able to do. But on the other hand, you could actually still sort of visualize the path. That is ultimately what you can get from these documents about Jesuit schooling, in a domain that happens to be more important to me now than the saxophone, which is the study of Latin. You can see people did this. People got to this incredible point of skill.
Cori, thanks for coming back onto the channel.
Yeah, sure. My pleasure.